There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a woman once the world has decided her story is finished. Juliet Cole knew that silence well. She had made a home in it, folded herself so small inside it that she'd stopped expecting to be seen at all, until a man with ice in his eyes and a grief he'd never spoken aloud looked at her across a crowded room and did not look away. What he offered her wasn't love. He was careful to say so himself. But some doors don't announce what's behind them until you're already standing in the room. And by the time Juliet understood what she'd truly walked into, in a house built on old grief and older silence, it was far too late to go back to the woman who'd stopped hoping. This is the story of what it cost her to be seen, and what it cost him to finally let her. The first time Juliet Cole saw her husband's face go entirely white with rage, she had been married to him for 6 weeks, and she had done nothing worse than open a door. She would come to think of that afternoon as the hinge the whole marriage turned on, the moment she understood that the man she'd bound herself to was not merely cold, but haunted, and that she had walked, uninvited, straight into the room where the haunting lived. But that was still ahead of her. On the Tuesday she turned 40, all she knew was that she was pinning up a hem and that nobody in the house had remembered the date at all. There was no ceremony to it. Her sister Marianne had forgotten, or pretended to, and the day unspooled exactly like the one before it. Porridge gone lukewarm by the time she reached the table, a stack of her nephew's shirts to let out at the seams, an afternoon spent hunting a lost glove that turned up, eventually, under the piano. It was only when she caught her reflection in the hall mirror, candlelight doing her no favors, throwing the lines at her mouth into sharp relief, that she remembered what day it was and what it meant. She did not cry. She had cried about this once, years ago, in a fit that had embarrassed her more than any refusal from any gentleman ever had, and she had decided afterward that she would not do it again. Grief that repeats itself stops being grief and starts being habit. So she stood in the hall a moment, pin still between her lips, and let the fact settle into her the way cold settles into a room when a window's left open. She was 40. She was unmarried. She would, in all likelihood, remain both those things until she was old and then dead. And somewhere in the last decade, she had stopped noticing the exact hour the hope had gone out. The way you don't notice a coal dying if you're not watching it. "You're wanted downstairs," said the housemaid, Peg, sticking her head round the door. "Mrs. Ashworth says the Pemberton boy's shirt won't fix itself." "No," Juliet agreed. "It certainly won't." She went down and fixed it. That was the shape of her days at Marianne's house on Curzon Street. Useful, occupied, entirely accounted for by other people's needs. She had come to live there 9 years ago, after their mother died and left Juliet with a small annuity, and no clear notion of what a woman without a husband or a fortune was meant to do with herself. And Marianne, 2 years younger, comfortably married to a comfortable man, had offered her a room with the particular generosity of someone who knows exactly what it's costing her to give it. "You'll be such a help with the children," Marianne had said, and had meant it kindly, and it had turned out to be nearly the whole of Juliet's use in that house ever since. She did not resent the children. That was the strange mercy of it. She resented, sometimes, in a low, unlovely way she was ashamed of, the manner in which her sister discussed her when she thought Juliet wasn't listening. Poor Juliet. You know, she never really had the looks for it, and now of course it's rather too late. But she's wonderful with the boys, as though Juliet's whole self had contracted down to a single serviceable function, like a chair or a good umbrella. She was thinking of this, still, 3 nights later, when Marianne insisted she come to the Ashworths' ball. "You cannot simply not appear," Marianne said, adjusting a bracelet in the glass. "People will remark on it. People remarked on it last year, when I did appear." "That's different. That was ordinary remarking. If you're not there at all, they'll think something's wrong with you, and then they'll ask me, and I haven't the patience for it tonight." Marianne turned, taking in Juliet's gray silk, with a small, private wince she didn't bother to hide. "Is that the only gown you own?" "It's the only one that fits." "Well," Marianne's mouth did something complicated. "Gray is very restful, I'm sure." It was, Juliet thought, dressing. Restful was the correct word for it, though her sister hadn't meant it as praise. The dove-gray silk had been made over so many times it no longer had a fashionable line to it anywhere, and it did what she most wanted a gown to do, which was disappear her into whatever room she stood in. She had learned the usefulness of being overlooked. It cost you the occasional ache, standing at the edge of a ballroom and watching girls half her age be handed the entire evening like a gift. But it also meant no one asked anything of you, and by 40, Juliet had come to understand that being asked nothing was its own kind of peace. She did not yet know that peace of that kind rarely lasts, and that hers had perhaps 3 days left to run. The Ashworths' ballroom that night was the usual glittering machinery, candlelight multiplying itself in mirrors, mothers steering daughters like cargo, young men circling the punch table with the deliberate carelessness of predators pretending to graze. Juliet found her chair near the potted fern, as she always did, and let the noise wash past her, and fanned herself, and was, for a while, entirely content to be furniture. It was Marianne who noticed him first. "There," her sister said, low, gripping Juliet's wrist with sudden, ungentle interest. "That's him. That's the Duke of Alden." Juliet followed her gaze to the doorway, where the crowd had done what crowds do around genuine power, thinned, without seeming to move at all. He was tall in the particular way that made a room recalculate its own proportions, dressed in unrelieved black that had nothing fashionable about it and didn't need to. Dark hair, a face that would have been handsome if it allowed itself to be anything at all. Instead, it held itself in a kind of permanent, controlled stillness, the look of a man reading a room he has already decided he dislikes. "They call him the Winter Duke," Marianne murmured, delighted with her own gossip. "Ice all through him, they say. Ever since, well, no one quite says since what. But he's buried a father and a brother in 5 years, and hasn't smiled at a soul since. Every mama in this room has thrown a daughter at him, and he's turned everyone away so politely they can't even complain about it properly. Lady Hollis tried in March. Her girl came away in tears and wouldn't say a word about what he'd told her. Juliet watched him decline a hopeful young woman with a bow so correct it was itself a kind of cruelty, and thought, there is a person entirely alone in a room full of people, and I know exactly what that feels like from the other direction. It was an unremarkable thought. She did not expect it to matter. Then he turned his head, scanning the room the way a man checks an exit, and his eyes went past the debutantes in their white and pink, past Marianne's eager face, and stopped on Juliet. She felt it before she understood it, a small, unwelcome lurch behind her ribs, the sort of thing a woman of 40 has no business feeling over a stranger across a ballroom. He did not smile. He did not look away either. For 3 full seconds, she counted them, absurdly, the way you count thunder after lightning. His gaze rested on her, with an attention that had nothing performing in it at all. Not admiration, not the practiced up-and-down men gave the young girls, something closer to recognition, as if he'd found, in a room full of actors, the one person not reciting lines. Then he looked away, toward some duty across the room, and it was over, and Juliet sat very still, with her fan gone motionless in her lap, and told herself, firmly, that it had meant nothing at all. She almost believed it. She had a great deal of practice believing inconvenient things. She thought that was the whole of it. She was wrong, and the manner in which she was wrong would arrive at her brother-in-law's front door in exactly 3 days, wearing black, asking for her by name. The butler found her in the schoolroom, correcting her nephew's Latin, and said, in a voice unsteady with the effort of not showing how unsteady it was, that Mr. Ashworth required her in the study, at once. "Is something wrong?" Juliet asked, rising. "There's a caller, miss. His Grace, the Duke of Alden." The Latin exercise sat forgotten on the desk. Juliet smoothed her skirt, which did nothing, since her hands were the ones shaking, and went down. She could hear, even before she reached the door, the particular silence of a room in which something has already been decided, and no one present has quite caught up to it. The study seemed smaller with him in it. He stood by the cold fireplace. She would learn, later, that he rarely sat when he could stand. That stillness for him was a chosen discipline and not a rest, and her brother-in-law hovered near his own desk like a man uncertain whether it was still his. "Miss Cole," the Duke said. His voice was low, unhurried, entirely without the polish other men used to soften what they said. "Thank you for receiving me." "Your Grace." She curtsied. Her brother-in-law made a small, strangled sound that might have been an attempt at a greeting. "I'll come to it directly," the Duke said. "I find long approaches waste everyone's patience, mine included. I've come to ask for your hand in marriage." The clock on the mantel ticked twice before anyone in the room remembered how breathing worked. Juliet heard her own voice from a distance. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I don't think I understood you." "You understood me." He did not soften it, did not repeat it more gently, simply let it stand, which she found she was grateful for, being spoken to plainly, after 9 years of being managed, felt almost indecent. "I'll be honest with you, since I think you'd prefer that to flattery. This isn't a love match. I require a wife capable of running a large household with sense and without theatrics. Someone who understands what silence is for, rather than someone who fears it." His eyes, gray and unhurried, held hers. "At the Ashworths, I watched a room full of people perform for 2 hours. You did not perform. I've thought of little else since." Her brother-in-law found his voice at last, thin and outraged on her behalf, in the way men are outraged when someone else's fortune threatens to overturn their sense of the world's order. "Your Grace, surely you're aware. Juliet is 40. She has no dowry to speak of. There must be some. That is, are you quite certain?" "I am entirely certain," the Duke said, without looking at him. "I've done the asking. I'd like the answering to come from Miss Cole." Juliet looked at this cold, correct stranger, and thought of her narrow room at the top of Marianne's house, of the particular exhaustion of being endlessly useful and never once necessary, and felt something in her chest that was not quite hope. She had put hope away 3 days before her last birthday and had no intention of digging it back up, but was, perhaps, its plainer cousin, the recognition of a door standing open, where she had believed, absolutely, that there were no more doors. "Why me?" she said, not the demure question a debutante might ask, fishing for compliments, but a real one, wanting a real answer. He considered it as though the question deserved consideration, which itself told her something. "Because you did not need the room to love you," he said. I find I no longer have patience for people who do. It was not romantic. It was, in its way, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a decade. Your Grace, Juliet said, and heard how steady her own voice had gone, as if some old, buried part of her had simply been waiting for a true offer to answer with a true yes. I accept. He did not smile, and she would think of that afterward, that he had gotten precisely what he'd asked for, and offered nothing back but a short, formal bow, as though a bargain, once struck, required no further sentiment at all. It should have troubled her more than it did. She told herself it was simply his manner. She did not yet know how much that manner was costing him to maintain, nor what it was built over. Marianne's reaction, once the shock of it had worn thin enough to admit calculation, was a masterclass in reversal. Within a fortnight she had gone from the Duke of Alden, preposterous, absurd. What did you do to bewitch him, to informing anyone who would listen that she had always known Juliet had a quiet depth that would attract a man of real substance, as though she herself had engineered the match by force of sisterly foresight. Juliet endured this the way she endured most things Marianne produced, without correction, because correction cost more than it purchased. The wedding itself was small, correct, and over quickly, the way she suspected he wanted everything to be that touched on feeling. Marianne wept into a handkerchief with a performance quality that fooled no one, least of all Juliet, who understood by now that her sister's tears were never quite for her. Within the week, Juliet was in a carriage heading north, watching London give way to hedgerow and then to moor, sitting across from a husband who spoke to her perhaps 4 times in 3 days, each time about the quality of the road or the next inn, and who otherwise watched the country pass with an attention that gave nothing at all away. She did not know, yet, whether she had married a prison or an escape. She suspected, watching his profile against the darkening window, that she would not know for some time. She found, to her own surprise, that she did not entirely mind the waiting. Holloway, when it finally rose out of the trees at the end of the drive, was not what she had pictured. No white stucco, no fashionable columns, just gray stone, old and huge and entirely unapologetic about being both, with mullioned windows catching the last of the light like 100 watching eyes. It looked less like a house than like something the land had grown, reluctantly, around a family that refused to leave it. The staff lined the steps to receive them, 2 neat rows of black and white, and at their head a stern housekeeper who looked Juliet over with the particular thoroughness of a woman deciding, in 4 seconds, exactly how much trouble the new mistress was going to be. Mrs. Fenwick, the Duke said, the Duchess, Your Grace. The housekeeper's curtsy was correct and entirely uninformative. Mrs. Fenwick, Juliet said, meeting her eyes rather than her hands. I hope we'll get on. Something flickered behind the housekeeper's face, surprise perhaps, at being addressed as a person rather than furniture, and was gone before it could be called an expression. The Duke did not linger for introductions. Mrs. Fenwick will see you settled. I've matters in my study. And he was gone down a corridor before Juliet had entirely finished being a bride, leaving her alone in a vast stone hall with a housekeeper who did not smile and a silence so complete it had a texture to it, like felt. Well, she thought, this is what I asked for. Dinner that first week was an education in a particular kind of loneliness. The 2 of them at opposite ends of a table, built for 40, courses arriving and departing, with the hushed efficiency of a house that had long ago stopped expecting conversation to accompany its meals. He ate with his attention on his plate. She ate with her attention on the room, cataloging it, the dust sheets on half the furniture, the portraits with their painted eyes, the particular quality of quiet that felt less like peace and more like held breath. On the fourth evening, she found Mrs. Fenwick in her small office among the ledgers and asked, mildly, whether the breakfast parlor might not do better for their meals than the long table. "It hasn't been used in some years, Your Grace." "Then, perhaps it's time." Juliet kept her voice light. "The distance at dinner is rather more than I can manage in conversation." The housekeeper studied her, a long, unreadable moment. "As you wish." When the Duke arrived for dinner the next evening and found a round table set for two before a low fire instead of the mahogany plane he'd eaten at alone for years, he stopped in the doorway. His eyes moved from the table to the fire to her. "I hope you don't object," Juliet said, her pulse going quicker than she liked. The other room felt rather like dining in a cathedral. A pause. Something in the rigid line of his shoulders eased, fractionally, the first give she'd seen in him. "No," he said, "I don't object." They sat, 3 feet apart instead of a mile, and the silence between them, though it did not vanish, changed its nature. It stopped being a wall and started, very slightly, to feel like a room they were both willing to sit in. His mother arrived without warning a fortnight later, a small, fierce woman with white hair and a spine like a poker, who swept into the hall, took one long look at Juliet and said, "Well, thank God, not a giggler," before anyone had managed introductions. "Mother," the Duke said, appearing from his study, with an expression Juliet was beginning to recognize as his particular brand of weary affection. "You might have written." "I read it in the papers like a stranger, Dominic. I came to see for myself." The dowager turned her sharp attention back to Juliet. "What's your name, girl?" "Juliet, Your Grace." "Call me Cordelia. Your Grace is for people I haven't decided to like yet." She took Juliet's arm without asking permission, the way certain old women simply assume the right to. "Come. Sit with me. Tell me everything, and leave nothing out on my son's account. I've known him longer than you have, and I promise you nothing you say will surprise me." Over tea, in a room that was clearly the dowager's own territory, unshrouded and warm, Cordelia extracted the whole story with a directness Juliet found she liked rather than resented. "He married you for your stillness, I'd wager," the old woman said when Juliet had finished. "Poetic nonsense, dressed up as sense. He married you because you're the first person in 5 years who didn't flinch at his silence. And he's drowning in this house, my girl. Drowning in it. And I think some animal part of him recognized you as something that could hold weight." She fixed Juliet with a look that was suddenly, entirely serious. "This is not an easy house. It has ghosts in it. My younger son." She stopped, started again. "Arthur's death broke something in Dominic that he has spent 5 years freezing over rather than feel. He thinks he wants quiet. What he needs is to be forgiven for something he has never once let himself confess. That is not a small thing to ask of a wife. I tell you honestly so you're not surprised later." "What would you have me do?" Juliet asked. "Nothing, yet. Don't try to fix him. He'll shatter rather than bend. Just occupy your space. Let the house learn the sound of you. He'll come to it, or he won't. But you cannot drag a man out of ice by pulling. You can only stay warm enough, long enough, that eventually he thinks to come to the fire himself." It was, Juliet thought, both the kindest and most unsettling advice anyone had ever given her. She would remember it 3 weeks later, in a corridor she had no business walking down, and wished she had asked Cordelia which doors, precisely, the old woman had meant. She took to the library the way water takes to the lowest room in a house. It was a soaring, neglected space. 2 stories of shelves under a coat of dust nobody had thought worth disturbing, and she began, without asking permission, to put it right. 1 shelf, 1 afternoon at a time, cloth in hand, learning the house through its books, the way another woman might learn a man through his letters. She found him there one night when she couldn't sleep, standing at the tall window in shirt sleeves, no coat, looking younger and less armored than she had yet seen him. "You're up late, Duchess." "I couldn't sleep." She hesitated. "I hope I haven't disturbed your solitude." "You haven't." He came away from the window into the candlelight, and something in the softness of the hour seemed to loosen him slightly. He touched the spine of a book on the shelf she'd just finished dusting. "My brother and I spent half our childhoods in this room," he read. "I preferred to be outdoors, generally getting muddy in ways that horrified our mother." It was the first time he had mentioned Arthur by anything other than absence. The name sat between them, small and enormous. "He sounds as though he was very alive," Juliet said carefully. Something crossed the Duke's face, not quite pain, not quite anything she had a name for. "He was," he said. "Everything I've never managed to be." Then, as if he'd heard himself reveal too much, "You should get some rest, Duchess. It's late." He left her there among the books and the moonlight, and she stood a long while after, her hand resting on a shelf, feeling the shape of something shift very slightly beneath the surface of their arrangement. Not yet named, not yet safe, but no longer nothing. She thought, that night, that she was beginning to understand him. She was not prepared for how completely her next mistake would prove her wrong. The trouble came, as trouble often does, from a locked door she hadn't known was locked. It was a wet afternoon in the East Wing, rain ticking steadily against glass she hadn't yet learned to associate with anything but weather, and she'd found a door standing ajar where she'd assumed the whole corridor was shut up. She told herself, afterward, that she should have simply walked past it. She had not. Curiosity, her one enduring vice, the thing that had gotten her into every scrape of her girlhood, and out of very few of them gracefully, carried her through it before caution caught up. The room inside was not shrouded like the others. It was preserved, precisely, as though its occupant had only just stepped out. A book face down on the nightstand, boots by the wardrobe, a riding crop laid across a chair, as if someone meant to return for it within the hour. Above the mantel hung a portrait of a young man, with the Duke's dark hair and none of his stillness, a face alive with mischief, laughing at whoever had painted him, eyes bright with a joy that made the room around it feel, by contrast, like held breath waiting 5 years to be let out. She was still looking at it, transfixed, when the floor creaked behind her. "What are you doing in here?" It was not a question. She turned, and the fury in his face stopped her breath entirely. Not loud fury, worse than that, a controlled and total whiteness, as though she'd put her hand directly on the wound he'd spent 5 years bandaging and pressed. "The door was open, I didn't realize. This wing is private, each word laid down like a stone, and behind the stones, unmistakably, something that was not anger at all, but its thinnest possible disguise. I'm sorry, She glanced helplessly at the portrait, unable to stop herself. He was very handsome. Get out. She fled. She did not stop until she reached her own rooms, where she sat with her hands shaking in her lap, and understood, with a cold, clean certainty, that she had trespassed on something sacred and been thrown out of it exactly as a trespasser deserves. Worse, she understood, replaying the whiteness of his face, that whatever lived in that room was not merely grief, it was guilt, and guilt of a size she had not yet begun to guess at, and she had walked directly into the middle of it, wearing muddy boots, and asking a dead boy's face whether he'd been handsome. She did not go down to dinner. She sent word of a headache and picked at a tray alone, listening to the silence of her own rooms, which had gone back to feeling like loneliness rather than peace. She thought, miserably, that she had ruined in one careless afternoon whatever fragile thing had begun to grow between them in the library, and that she had no earthly idea how to mend it, or whether he would even permit her the chance to try. The knock, when it came, was one she hadn't expected. She opened the door to find him standing in the corridor, coatless, looking entirely unlike a duke, and entirely like a man who had spent an hour talking himself into this. "My behavior this afternoon was unforgivable," he said, the words coming out stiff, dragged. "I've come to apologize." "You needn't." "I do." He would not quite meet her eyes. "That room. I hadn't been in it myself in 5 years. Seeing you there was—" He stopped. "I'm sorry for your loss," Juliet said quietly. "Whatever it was, I shouldn't have asked." He was silent a long moment, a man balanced on an edge she could see but not name. "He was everything I am not," he said at last, so quietly she nearly missed it, full of light, and then, as if he'd allowed himself exactly that much and no further, "Good night, Duchess." He turned and was gone before she could answer, leaving her with the strange, trembling certainty that something had cracked open in him tonight, however briefly, and that he had come to her, of everyone in that vast house, to stand at the edge of it. She did not yet know his brother's name. She would not learn it for weeks more, and when she did, it would come to her in the middle of the worst storm of the year, from a man who had spent 5 years making sure no one ever asked him to say it aloud. Autumn deepened, the moor went to rust and gold, and something in the house deepened with it, not warmth precisely, not yet, but a kind of settling, 2 people learning the shape of a shared quiet rather than enduring a divided one. He began joining her in the library of an evening, reading in the chair opposite hers with no need to speak. The silence between them had stopped being a wall and become, gradually, a shared room. He began asking her opinion on the estate, the tenants, the accounts, not as a man testing a hire, but as a man who had decided, without announcing it, that her judgment could be trusted with things that mattered. There was, too, the matter of the assembly at Clevmore. It was the first occasion requiring her to appear as his duchess before anyone but his own staff and his own mother. A county assembly, modest by London standards, but populated entirely by people who had known the Alden name for 3 generations and had spent 5 years speculating, in the particular vicious leisure of the countryside, about what precisely had frozen the young Duke solid. Juliet felt the weight of their attention the moment she entered the room on his arm. Not unkind, exactly, but hungry, the way a room is hungry for a story it has been denied too long. "Smile if you must," Cordelia murmured at her elbow, having installed herself at Juliet's side like a second, sharper conscience. "But not too much. They'll forgive you being plain. They will never forgive you looking pleased with yourself for catching him." "I didn't catch him," Juliet said. "He asked. They don't care for the distinction, my girl. Watch." She watched. She saw the way the matron's eyes went to her gown, her age, her hands, cataloging her the way Mrs. Fenwick had on the front steps, deciding how much trouble she represented. She heard, without quite meaning to, a whispered exchange near the punch table. They say he only wanted someone who wouldn't ask him for affection. Poor creature. Imagine marrying for that. And felt the old, familiar sting of being discussed, as though she were a piece of furniture that had been unexpectedly relocated. It was Dominic, oddly, who noticed first. He had been speaking with a neighboring landowner about drainage rights, a conversation of such profound tedium that Juliet had assumed his attention entirely elsewhere. But he broke off mid-sentence, excused himself with a curtness that startled the other man, and crossed the room to her side. "You've gone somewhere else," he said, low, for her alone. "I'm quite well. You're not." He did not touch her, but he stood close enough that his presence alone seemed to draw a line around her, cutting off the room's hungry attention as effectively as a wall. "Whatever you heard, ignore it. They'll have a new story, by Michaelmas. They always do. Does it not trouble you, what they say of us?" He considered this with his usual unhurried gravity. "It troubled me a great deal, once, what people said. I found, eventually, that the ones worth minding rarely say anything at all." His eyes held hers, gray and steady. "You are the first thing this house has had worth defending in 5 years, Duchess. I find I mind their opinion of you a great deal more than I ever minded their opinion of me." It was, she would think later, the closest thing to a declaration he had yet made her, delivered in the flattest possible tone in the middle of a county assembly, and it did more to steady her than any tender word could have. They did not stay long. He made their excuses within the half-hour, and in the carriage home, in the dark, he sat closer to her than the width of the seat required, and said nothing at all, and she understood that this, too, was its own kind of declaration. The trouble Marianne brought was of an older, more familiar sort. "She means to visit," Juliet said at breakfast, refolding the letter with its familiar, careless seal. "With the children. She fears I must be lonely. And when does she propose to descend upon us?" "A week's time." "I see." He set his cup down with a small, definite click. "This is your home, Juliet. You are not their governess any longer. See that Mrs. Fenwick prepares the guest wing, and see that you do not fall back into old habits on their account." He had used her given name, not Duchess, Juliet. It landed in the space between them, with more weight than she knew what to do with. Marianne arrived like weather, loud, certain, already deciding how much pity the visit required. She kissed Juliet's cheek, called the house gloomy, though very grand, I'm sure, and by the third evening had settled entirely back into her old habit of treating her sister as an unpaid convenience. "Juliet, be a dear. Clara's hem wants fixing. You know how clever you are with a needle," as though 9 years and a duchy had changed nothing at all. Juliet felt the old obedience rise in her before she could stop it, the automatic reach for her sewing kit. "Clara," the Duke said, before she'd risen from her chair. His voice was quiet and cut cleanly through the room. "Your aunt is the Duchess of Alden. She is not a lady's maid. If your hem wants mending, you'll ask your own mother, or ring for one of the staff whose place it is." He turned his gray gaze on Marianne, who had gone a furious, blotchy red. "And in future, Mrs. Ashworth, you'll address my wife with the respect her position requires. Is that understood?" The room went entirely still. Marianne, for perhaps the first time in Juliet's memory, had nothing at all to say. "I meant no disrespect," she managed at last. "Old habits, Your Grace. Juliet and I have always been so close. Then I'd cultivate new ones." He rose. "Juliet, a game of chess in the library?" It was an order and a rescue and an invitation, all at once. "I'd like that very much," she said, and walked out with him, leaving her sister sitting in a silence that was, for once, entirely her own to manage. In the library, setting up the board, he did not look at her when he spoke. "She had no right to speak to you so." "Thank you," Juliet said softly. "Don't thank me." He moved a pawn, his eyes finally lifting to hers, serious and certain. "I married you for your stillness. I find I have no intention of watching anyone, your own sister included, try to strip it from you in my house." She looked at the board, at the carved ivory king and queen standing their small, stubborn distance apart, and felt something in her chest that she had genuinely believed, at 40, she would never feel again. "Check," she said. He looked up and smiled, not the almost smile she'd catalogued so carefully over the past weeks, but a real one, unguarded, that took 10 years off his face and put something entirely new there instead. "So it is," he said. The storm came in late October, off the North Sea, 3 days of wind that turned the moor to a gray, howling smear against the glass. They were marooned in the house together, the world outside dissolved, and on the second night she found him pacing the library rather than reading, stopping at the window, resuming, stopping again, a man circling something he could not quite make himself approach. She watched him from her chair for some minutes before she understood what she was seeing. Not restlessness, but dread. The particular dread of a man who knows the calendar has brought him round again to a date he has spent all year trying not to count toward. "It was a night like this," he said finally, not turning from the glass, "when Arthur died." She set her book down and said nothing, giving him the only thing she had learned by then that he actually needed, her silence, offered rather than imposed. He loved to sail. "Better than I ever was, more daring." His voice had gone low, rough, stripped of its usual discipline. He was home from university, wanted to take the boat out despite the glass falling. I told him it was folly. He laughed it off, said he'd be back before the worst of it. His hand, on the mantel, had gone white at the knuckle. I should have forbidden it. I was the elder, the Duke, God help me, even then. But he had this light in him, and I could never bear to be the one who put it out. So I went with him instead, told myself it was to watch over him. The wind howled at the glass like something trying to get in. "We were a mile out when it hit," he said. "The mast came down. He went into the water. I had my hand on his collar, and the wreckage pulled the current wrong, and I lost him. I searched until they made me stop. They found the boat the next morning. They found him 2 days after." He turned to face her at last, and his face was the face of a man who had spent 5 years standing trial before a jury of 1. I was his guardian. I was supposed to be watching him, and I let him die. Juliet crossed the small distance between them and did not offer him comfort shaped like a lie. "You couldn't have forbidden him the sea any more than the tide," she said. "You went with him to watch over him. You went into the water after him. You held on as long as there was anything to hold." She placed her hand over his clenched fist on the cold marble, a small, deliberate warmth. "That isn't failure, Dominic. That's love. You were present with him in his joy, and you were present with him at the end. That's all any of us are given to do." He stared at her, as though she'd said something in a language he'd forgotten he knew. A single tear went down his face, and he did not seem to notice it falling. Slowly, his fist unclenched beneath her hand, and he turned it over and took hold of hers instead. The first time, she realized, he had ever truly held her hand, rather than simply touched it in passing, and said nothing further, because there was nothing further that needed saying. They stood like that a long while, the storm working itself out against the windows, two people no longer alone in it. The house that greeted her the next morning was washed and quiet in a new way, not the old held-breath silence, but something closer to peace. She found him at the breakfast parlor window, and the change in his face stopped her in the doorway. The lines of 5 years' strain had eased, not vanished, but eased, the way frost eases when the sun finally reaches a window it's held all night. "Good morning, Juliet." "Good morning, Dominic." They talked, that morning, of things that had nothing to do with the estate. Her childhood, the music she loved, the years before either of them had known the other existed. And she understood she was being learned, finally, as thoroughly as she had learned him. Afterward, he took her up to the east wing, to the door that had once thrown her out of it, and unlocked it himself, and let the morning in. "I'm having the portrait moved to the gallery," he said, looking up at his brother's laughing face. "With the rest of the family, it's time." He turned to her and said, with a calm that did nothing to disguise the size of what he was saying, "And I'd like to open these rooms again, perhaps for a nursery." She could not, for a moment, find her voice at all. "I married you for your silence," he said, taking her hands. "I believed that was what I needed, a quiet port to hide in. I find you were never a port, Juliet. You're a lighthouse. You don't offer somewhere to hide. You show a man the way home." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles. "I bargained for a duchess. I have found, by some miracle I did nothing to earn, a wife." The room held the morning light, and the memory of a boy who had loved the sea too much, and the shape of a future neither of them had thought themselves entitled to. Juliet Cole, who had let hope go out quietly on her 40th birthday, understood that she had not, after all, been destined for the shelf. She had simply been waiting for the right door. 2 years later, the library fire was going well past the hour it usually was banked, because no one in the room had noticed the time. Dominic was on the floor, on his hands and knees. An indignity no duke should suffer, and no duke, Juliet thought, had ever worn so easily, while their son, not yet 2, rode his back and shrieked with the particular delight of a child who has just discovered his father can be made to growl like a bear. Cordelia sat by the fire with her knitting, watching them both with an expression she'd have denied, if asked, was sentiment. "I never thought I'd live to see him play the fool," she said. "He's very good at it," Juliet said, "when he tries." A letter had come that morning from Marianne, civil now, even warm in places, asking after the children, asking, in a line that had cost her sister a good deal of pride to write, for advice on a matter concerning Clara. Juliet had written back kindly. The world had a way of righting itself, given enough time and enough patience, though she suspected not every world did, and she did not take for granted the one she'd been given. Dominic caught their son's small hand as it patted his face, kissed it, and looked up to find her watching him, and smiled, not the almost smile of a stranger learning to trust her, but the whole thing, easy and entirely hers. It had not been a whirlwind. It had been built, slowly, silence by silence, the way you build anything meant to last, not discovered whole, but chosen, and then chosen again, on every ordinary evening when it would have been easier not to. Juliet rested a hand on the gentle swell of her stomach, where their second child was already making its presence known, and thought that this, the fire, the laughter, the man on the floor pretending to be a bear, was not the shelf at all. It was, simply, home, and she had gotten there in the end, not by hoping for it, but by staying still long enough for it to find her.